Osteon, C. Or at the ends of long bones, one finds articular cartilage, D. Number 5, marrow exists inside the medullary cavity, A. 6, the epiphyseal plate would be found, C, near the end of a bone. 7, cells that create new bone tissue, bone-forming cells, are called osteoblasts, B. 8, the ends of each bone have a covering of cartilage, B. I already asked that one. 9, a fractured bone often has an area of blood called a hematoma, B. 10, bones all develop from masses of hyaline cartilage. Bonus, Mr. Blank is the name given to the face and left side of a skull. I don't know what that is. I don't know where that comes from.
It's Mr. Smiley.
In the book, the stained fetus was blank weeks old.
3. 4.
14.
I put 14.
If cancer of the blank gland reaches the bone marrow, they stimulate osteoblast activity.
Pancreas.
Prostate.
Mammary.
Do you know that for sure? You just saying
No, I'm
that?
saying I know that for sure.
I'll listen to it.
It's in the very end.
You're right, it is prostate.
How many questions were there? 10 or 9?
There were 10 questions. All right. Are you filming?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
What did you say it started? There's like this big glare on the screen.
Yeah.
She's not gonna be able to see that.
Sometimes that happens. Sometimes you can see it better on the video than on that little screen. All right. We already talked about the skeleton and all the different bones here. There are words that you need to know that stand for parts of a skeleton. We will have a quiz on this tomorrow. It's table 7.2, page 142. So the quiz will be on this. It will be a matching quiz. Okay? So let me say all these words for you, because when we're pointing to parts of bones, you have to use these words. And it makes a lot more sense if you've memorized what the words are than having to memorize each time you pass it. So, a condyle, a rounded process that usually articulates with another bone. Articulates means joins with. So a condyle is a round piece of a bone that joins with another bone. Condyles are usually pretty large. A crest is a narrow ridge-like projection. Parts of the skeleton have crests, narrow ridge-like portions. An epicondyle, a projection situated above a condyle. So epi means above. So condyle is this rounded projection, and above the condyle you might have an epicondyle, a little projection above the condyle. A facet is a flat surface. A fontanelle, a soft spot in the skull where membranes cover the space between bones. Have you ever heard that a baby's head has soft spots? Those are called fontanelles. It's because their bones of their head haven't grown together yet. They will grow together later. is an opening through which a bone, that is usually is a passageway for blood vessels, nerves, or ligaments. A foramen is a hole in a bone. A fossa is a deep pit or depression in a bone. Some bones have dips in them, and those are called fossas. Some bones have foveas, tiny pit or depression. So a deep pit is a fossa, a tiny pit is a fovea. The head of a bone is an enlarged end of a bone. The head of the humerus is the round part of the humerus. This is one everyone mispronounces. Meatus. Meatus, not meatus. Meatus, a tube-like passageway within a bone. There's a meatus that goes through your skull to your ear. It's a little tube. It's a passageway that leads to your inner ear. It's what you stick a Q-tip through, the meatus. A process is a projection on a bone. Sinus is a cavity within a bone. We already studied some of the sinuses.
What is the projection?
Projection is something sticking off of a bone. A piece that kind of comes off of it, projects outward. A spine is a thorn-like projection. Sometimes the projections look like needles, and we call them spines. You'll see that in the skull, or on the scapula. A suture, an interlocking line of union between bones. A suture looks like a zigzag line. Kind of goes like that. Your skull bones, your skull bones grow together and meet at a suture. A trochanter, a relatively large process. A tubercle is a small process. A process is, again, something coming off of a bone. Now, some of these are kind of repeats. They call it a trochanter or a condyle. They're kind of the same thing. Condyles match with other bones where trochanters do not. Tuberosity, a knob-like process larger than a tubercle. The trochanter is large, tuberosity is kind of medium, and tubercle is small. Those three are easy to screw up. But once you've memorized these terms, then when you start going through and start memorizing parts of bones, it makes a lot more sense. If you know what a foramen is, it's a hole, and you're trying to identify the foramen magnum on the skull, and you know what foramen means, a hole. And if you know a little Latin, you know magnum means big. You know what you're looking for on the skull?
A big hole.
A big hole somewhere. That's what you need to be pointing to. So don't point to some process that's sticking out. Point to something that's a hole. And you got a lot better chance of getting it right. You see what I'm saying? So it's a good idea to just learn these words and then go on with the IDing of all the parts of the bone. Now, with that in mind, let me go through the parts of the skull. This is probably the hardest IDs are when you do the skull. Now, they have pictures, pages 143 and 144 and 145 of the skull from different views. But I don't want you to automatically freak out. Are you getting this, McLean? Are you showing this? I don't want you to, like on the video, I mean.
Oh, well, yeah.
You got,
Yeah,
can you see me? Okay.
I mean, it's not going to be able to see that, but I can see me.
On the skull, you see all these parts, and people look at this and go, I've had a student come up to me and go, Mr. Willis, There's all these parts, and we got to know all these parts too, and all these parts, and all these parts. Most of them are repeats because the skull is just turned in different ways, you see. So the frontal bone is the orange bone here in the front, and it's also the frontal bone right here, this orange bone. It's the same bone. You don't have to rememorize frontal bone twice. There's actually 22 bones of the skull, so you got to know 22 bones. But there's two parietal bones, one on the left and one on the right. So you really have to know less than 22 words there. And then there's parts of bones too. So let me go through some of these. The frontal bone is in the front, and the parietal bone is on the side. And you can see the suture there joining the two bones. The sutures actually have names. This one's called the coronal suture. This one right here is called the squamous suture. I'll show it to you better on the side.
So we have to know those two.
Yeah, you have to know all these. Anything that's on your list, that's on that sheet, you have to know. Oh, this is called the temporal bone here on the side, and the sphenoid bone. That one's hard to pronounce. Sphenoid. It's like saying sphere, like a sphere. A round object is a sphere. A sphenoid bone is this purple one here. The lacrimal bone is right here, kind of where your tears would come out. Lacrimal means tears in Latin or Greek or something like that. The ethmoid bone is right behind it. And you'll see when we open up the skull, the ethmoid bone is actually really big. These little nasal concha, those are part of the ethmoid bone. These things right here are called nasal concha. And they're inside your nasal cavity. And they're covered with skin and mucous membrane. They help filter the air that comes in through your nose. There's the nasal bone there. If you get hit in the face, sometimes you break your nasal bone. The maxilla is the big upper jawbone, and the mandible is the lower jawbone. And there's the mental foramen. Now, if you know what foramen means, do you know what foramen means?
Hole.
Hole. Do you know what mental refers to?
Chin.
The chin region. So the chin hole, the mental foramen, you see. But once you know the roots of these, they'd be easy to find, even if you had never seen a picture of it. The mental foramen, oh, that must be a hole in your chin. There's only one of them, so that's it. Well, there's two of them, one on each side. The zygomatic bone is your cheekbone. Here's the sinuses. We already learned these, some of these. We didn't learn the maxillary sinus. We learned the other three. So here's the same skull turned to the side, and you can see a little bit different parts. This bone right here is real interesting. This is all the red here is one bone. It's the temporal bone. It's a single bone, but it's got all these processes and things coming off of it. This is called the styloid process. Muscles attached to this thing. Muscles that help move your jaw. This is called the mastoid process. You see it's this big hump here. Muscles that help move your jaw attached to that. Here's the external acoustic meatus, the tube that leads into your eardrum. So there's a hole in the temporal bone. And then there's also the zygomatic process. This is a process that sticks off the temporal bone that joins with the zygomatic bone. So right here is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, right there. And right here is the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. So this is part of the zygomatic bone that hits the temporal bone, so it's the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. Process means something sticking off of it. Here you see some more suture names. That's called the squamous suture. That's called the coronal suture. If you're freaking out, how am I going to learn all this stuff? That's what our IG time is going to be for. You're going to sit down and learn all it. I just want to go through and say some of the words here. That's the coronoid process of the mandible, and that's the mandibular condyle of the mandible. You'll also get a lot of omits on this next test, too, so you don't have to know all of these, but you got to know a good portion of it. Looking from underneath, look at that. That's a big hole, isn't it? What do you think we'd call that? The foramen magnum. That's where the spine comes up through. The occipital bone is in the back. There's the temporal bone again, and all those processes and stuff I just read you. Here's the sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone looks like a butterfly to me. Look at that purple bone there. Doesn't it look like a butterfly? There's the palatine bone. The palatine bone makes up the roof of your mouth. The roof of your mouth is actually a couple of bones, the maxilla and the palatine bone. You may have heard of the palate, the palate of your mouth. There's the vomer bone, another little bone of the skull. Here's taking off the top of the skull and looking down inside. You can see some of those same bones and foramens. This area here, this is a cool area. It's in the sphenoid bone. Again, the sphenoid bone to me looks like a butterfly. Looks like a bat from inside the skull, doesn't it? Sphenoid bone is cool. It looks like a butterfly or a bat. I don't know how you can remember that. Sphenoid bone butterfly. I don't know. There's sphenoid bone Batman. I don't know.
Spring? They're in the spring. No, not bad.
Sphenoid. Anyway, this sella turcica, it's a little dip in the sphenoid bone. That's where your pituitary gland sits. Have you ever heard of pituitary gland? It's the master gland. It sits right down in there. And this is a little notch that sticks up. It's called the crista galli, and it sits on a flat part of the ethmoid bone called the cribriform plate. So the cribriform plate is a flat part, and this crystal galli is a part coming up from that, kind of like a sail coming up from a ship. The flat part is the cribriform plate, and the sail part that comes up is the crista galli. You'll see that when you look inside your skull. Inside the skull in there. You know, I have a real human skull in there.
Really?
I'll show it to you.
Pretty cool.
Here's if you cut the skull in half, you could see all the parts. Look at that sinus right there. See the space inside the bone? That's the sphenoidal sinus. If you cut the skull exactly in half, you'll see this open space. And look at this frontal sinus. If you've had a sinus headache, see this open space sometimes gets blocked where air cannot get into it and out of it. The little passageways into it get blocked by mucus sometimes when you're sick. It gives you a sinus headache. Pressure builds up in there. Not all of these words are on your list. Oh, look at this plate right here, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. That separates the two nasal cavities. Your left nasal cavity and your right nasal cavity are separated by a thin sheet of bone right there. So you can't stick your finger in your nose and go over and get to the other side. There's a bone in the way. Did I ever tell you about my buddy Mitch Bronk?
Mm-mm.
He could snake a piece of spaghetti through his nose and have it come out of his mouth. And he would,
Oh my God.
That's Dr. Brock. You know that? Yeah, he's very talented. He was a hit at lunch.
My Uncle Jeff, you know him?
Jeff.
Miracle.
Oh, yeah, met him.
Well,
I think.
This past weekend he got an oyster, and it was like it was his nose, and it came out of his mouth.
You want to see a skull spinning around?
Yeah.
Why would you not want to see a skull spinning
Not that
around? I just happen to have a video of a skull spinning around. See the sutures there on the top?
It's the coolest video ever.
Why do I have a video of a skull spinning around? I have no idea. So there you go. So we're going to go in there and do our IDs, and you can work on the skull some today, or finish up the others you haven't done. And I'll show you the real human skull. You got to be very careful with the real human skull. It's very delicate. Are you done here?
Yes, sir.